So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. It's great to be with you for the August edition of our Inside Track election series. The election season is really starting to get underway. The Democratic National Convention wraps up tonight. The Republican National Convention is next week. And then 2 weeks from now, Labor Day is the traditional start of the election calendar, but it really does feel like we're already off to the races. I have a couple of things I'd like to get through today with you. And again, as Ellen said, please don't hesitate to submit any questions you may have at any point using the Q&A function. Today, I'm going to go through some of the context around what's happening in the election right now. Perceptions of Donald Trump, he's the incumbent president. The election very much continues to be a referendum on him. Our latest polling data on the general election, and then finally a section looking at some public opinion data around election legitimacy and increasing concerns about if this is going to be a fair election and what happens if potentially the president calls it into question. So to start off with, the context. This is the environment, all of the things that are going on that is shaping the election moment. And first off, I just want to show you this slide and don't really feel like you have to read it. But this is the #1 political news topic each day for the last month. And when you get the slides and sort of spend some time to look at it, you'll notice that basically it changes every day. There's not any single topic that lasts more than 2 days. And I think that's a real characteristic of our news cycle, the 24-hour news cycle right now, where it's just a constant barrage of stuff. And if you are like most Americans and you're not really a political news junkie who is monitoring all the ins and outs of it, it's overwhelming and it's hard to keep track of what's happening at any given moment in time. And I think we see that in the main issue question that we continue to track, where there's not really a single main issue that's dominating. Coronavirus, of course, continues to be sort of the main concern for most Americans, but it's not really being filtered in any single specific way. There's a lot of people who are thinking about it from a healthcare perspective. There's a lot of other people who are thinking it from an economic perspective. And I think that's partially because of this 24 hours news cycle, this cacophony of information that we're all getting. And that one, honestly, that Donald Trump is actually something of a master of that we'll get to in a moment. The #1 news story, though, continues to be some way or the other the coronavirus pandemic. The United States continues to struggle with it. We've seen the total number of new cases coming down from the peak that we saw in mid to late July, but we still have over 5.5 million cases. That's essentially 2% of the U.S. population that's tested positive at this point. The number of deaths has also trended up a little bit in August and has been more or less stable over the last couple of weeks, but still over 1,000 people are dying each day of the coronavirus, so stable at a worrisomely high level. And it looks like Americans have sort of adapted to the moment because a lot of behaviors around the coronavirus have stabilized. One of the real big adaptations Americans have made is the idea of wearing a mask when you leave the home. In our latest Axios Ipsos Coronavirus Index, 65% of Americans say they're wearing a mask at all times when leaving the home. I know from when I leave the house, I certainly see most people out and about with a mask on. However, there's still a lot of differences in who is and is not wearing a mask, particularly if you look at partisanship. Virtually all Democrats say that they're wearing one at all times versus only about half of Republicans. That plays out a little bit across the country too, where people in rural areas are much less likely to be wearing masks. But other sort of coronavirus adaptation behaviors are really sort of fallen by the wayside. So people sort of quarantining, that is the really intense level of self-isolation. Fewer than 1 in 5 Americans are continuing to do that. People still say they're socially distancing, but the meaning of the social distancing has really sort of morphed to be much more about wearing a mask and not sort of shaking hands with people versus really the keeping a literal distance away from folks, because again, we're seeing about 50%, about half of Americans are socializing with friends or family in a given week. About 1 in 5 are socializing with elderly relatives in a given week. About 1 in 3 are going out to restaurants or bars or those sort of establishments in any given week, which certainly is not back up to pre-coronavirus levels, but is definitely above sort of that April quarantine period we saw. And those numbers have all been relatively stable for the last 2 months. Again, I think reflecting how Americans have very much adapted to the pandemic. And the question I think going forward is, do these numbers continue to be stable over the next 80 days to the election, or do we see any sort of new events drive an increase in cases, an increase in deaths that may shake things up again? And there's certainly plenty of opportunities for things to happen in the remaining time before the election. Another news item has been the ongoing protests. We saw the president try to turn them into a political issue by sending federal law enforcement to Portland to try to clamp down on them. However, it's been a bit of a mixed bag for the president. We do see Americans are very much divided on the idea of law and order versus protesting, almost down the middle. But people don't necessarily see Trump's behavior as being terribly altruistically motivated. When we asked people if the federal agents being sent to Portland were about law and order, or about furthering Trump's agenda, again, people were split. So it's not really the kind of issue that Trump can use to cut off independent or undecided voters and pull them into his coalition. Instead, it continues to really be more of a base sort of play. Another issue that's really popped up in the last couple of weeks is about the Postal Service. President Trump put his own person in charge of the Postal Service a few months ago. That person put a bunch of new policies in place about efficiency that seem to be causing the Postal Service to experience a lot of delays in delivery. And then there's been a lot of conversation lately about the Postal Service needing money to continue operations in the face of the pandemic, and Trump opposing that because he believes it is a way to end voting by mail fraud, which is a thing that we'll get into in a few minutes and isn't real. But still, it's something that he seems to be very opposed to. But the problem is that the Postal Service is a vital service for Americans. In a particular week, 3/4 of Americans get something through the mail that they want to get, not just junk mail. A lot of people are getting packages with sort of this coronavirus world where we're all sort of getting stuff online and having it delivered. And then 1 in 5 people are getting medications through the mail. So again, these are people who probably need those medications for their health and well-being. And some of this stuff is really sort of monkeying around with it. And we see, again, that overwhelming majorities of the public are in favor of a postal service, having a smooth functioning postal service. And that's potentially why we've seen the Postmaster General sort of backtrack on some of these efficiency things that have caused it to be an issue. Again, big news in the last week was the nomination of Kamala Harris as the Democratic vice presidential pick. It's generally been warmly received. People are generally approve of it. A majority of Americans see it as a historic milestone for the country, the first Black woman to be a major party nominee. She gave actually the keynote address last night. It seems to have been pretty warmly received as well. So all in all, the Harris pick has been, for at least a couple of news cycles, a relatively positive topic for the Democrats, but not necessarily one that is dominating. And that's, I think, because this is such a chaotic news cycle. It's been hard to produce a breakthrough moment that really sort of crystallizes or changes how the country is viewing things. This is from our social media monitoring of the first night of the convention, Monday night. And what we saw is essentially that on Twitter, the large majority of conversation is about Donald Trump because he's the incumbent. It's a referendum on him. And it was only until relatively late in the evening when Michelle Obama gave her relatively passionate remarks about sort of the country and about how it's important to sort of be the better angels of our nature, that we saw volume and conversation about her surpass about President Trump. And it was even then only for a few moments. And I think that really is a reflection of our reality of Donald Trump just truly dominates the news cycle, dominates the airwaves. And everything that the Democrats do can maybe break through for a moment, but it's hard to have that sustained focus that a campaign would really want to be able to drive their message. So speaking of Donald Trump, so all of this stuff that's been happening, all of these news stories we're talking about, all of these events and everything else haven't really had an impact on President Trump's approval rating. In our Reuters Ipsos polling, we still have him right where he's been for the last couple of months, 39% in last week's polling, 40% the week before. So really right at that 40% level we've seen him at through most of the summer. And I think this is a characteristic of this chaotic news cycle in that because there's no sustained attention on any one thing, nothing's really getting through enough to really change people's minds. It's too fast. It's too quick. We saw just, in fact, the last couple of days, the Senate, Republican-controlled Senate, released a report talking about collusion between staff on Trump's 2016 election in Russia, saying that essentially there was collusion, which is sort of what the Mueller report sort of inched up to, but then didn't necessarily say. And yet, it's not really filtering through. There's not really anything happening. And then today, Steve Bannon, functionally Trump's campaign manager in 2016, was indicted for wire fraud around bilking people out of money about building the wall. And again, is it going to filter through and actually affect perceptions of the president? I'm somewhat skeptical because I think that the president's extremely effective at changing the subject and keeping things moving so quickly that nothing has time to sink in. Speaking of which, tonight is the last night of the DNC, as I mentioned, and I would bet you dollars to donuts that Donald Trump does something tomorrow to change the subject away from the Democrats and Biden's nomination back onto himself. No idea what it's going to be, but pretty confident it's going to happen. Friday, maybe Saturday, but definitely something to pull attention back. And that's his special gift. That's his superpower. He has a understanding of how to manipulate the news cycle more than any politician has had in recent American history. But Donald Trump's approval rating isn't really uniform across the country. And this is important because, again, our elections are based on the Electoral College. And what is really going to be important is looking at those states where his approval rating is sort of in those middle levels between 40 and 45%, maybe a little above 45%. And that's where we get those swing states you probably hear everyone talking about, is those are those places where Trump is moderately popular, but not overwhelmingly popular. So that is the upper Midwest, those states that were the blue wall that Hillary Clinton lost to Trump in 2016, of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. It's also sort of the southern Atlantic region, so North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and then it's the parts of the West, the Southwest, Arizona, and Nevada specifically. These are places where Trump's popularity is not great. It's not overwhelming. It's not as high as it is in the deep South or the Mountain West, for instance, but it's not as low as it is in the Northeast in New York or Massachusetts or on the West Coast like California, where his approval rating's in the 30% sort of range. And these are the battlegrounds really that the election is going to be fought. And it's really going to be fought around the idea of, do you think Trump is doing a good job or not? As we move forward again through these next 80 some odd days. So turning to the general election, we're actually seeing a lot of stability overall in our polling. There's been a slight tightening over the last couple of weeks rather, from Biden having about a 10-point lead among registered voters down to about an 8-point lead. Still a pretty sizable margin, a larger margin than Hillary Clinton enjoyed in 2016. And it's been relatively consistent going forward. We will be starting to report on likely voters soon. Ipsos tends to not report on likely voters until close to the election, because likely voters is essentially us guessing who's going to vote, and it's hard to really do an accurate guess until we're close enough to the election that people are actually making an informed choice of if they're going to vote. But one of the things we're seeing in our early likely voter modeling is it doesn't really change the picture at all. Biden's lead is pretty consistent, again, around 8 points when you go to likely voters. And that, I think, reflects how Democrats are particularly enthusiastic about voting this year. Typically, Republicans have an advantage when you use likely voters because Republicans typically turn out at higher rates, but that does not necessarily seem to be the case quite yet this year. The other thing to note is undecided voters. Undecided voters in 2016, at this point in time, made up almost 20% of registered voters. This year, it's down to 12%. I think that's a factor of how partisan this country is right now and how divisive the president is right now, that there's just not a lot of people left out there that are really undecided. People kind of know how they feel about Donald Trump one way or the other. And the people who are still undecided are really people who are just not terribly following things terribly closely, and they're not really invested in in politics or the election for the most part. But this is, again, something that we're going to be following because the number of undecided voters is still larger than the margin between Biden and Trump. Remember from that last slide, it was 8% point margin. The 12% undecided voters is enough to swing it if they all went, or if most of them even went for the president. So this is something we're going to continue monitoring. And if you were with us last week, I showed you some analysis we've done of undecided voters, sort of looking at which way they might be going. Right now, it looks like they're more likely to go Biden than Trump, just like it was a month ago. But again, we're going to continue monitoring that as we move towards the election. The electorate remains highly partisan and highly split, with virtually all Democrats behind Biden, virtually all Republicans behind Trump. Independents are split, though a plurality of them are behind Biden, and that's really the difference this year. The other thing, though, that's worth noting is that Trump is losing a little bit more Republicans than Biden is Democrats. Trump is losing 8% of Republicans versus Biden losing 5% of Democrats. It's not a huge number, but it is something to keep your eye on, particularly as the DNC has really focused on trying to make the case that Biden is the kind of Democrat that moderate Republicans can vote for, even going so far as including former Republican Governor Kasich on the opening night and former Republican Colin Powell in the schedule. They've really made an effort to try to portray Biden as a reasonable choice for people who are turned off by Trump but still think of themselves as Republicans. So we'll see if that holds up as we get closer to the election. One of the things, though, that we really view as a great way to understand what's happening is what people see as the main issue. And like I mentioned earlier, coronavirus is, of course, the main issue facing the country, but there's a lot of different ways people are interpreting that. And this is a slide sort of shows that. So there's having a plan to recover from the coronavirus. There is restoring trust in the American government, something around sort of having a functional response, and then having a strong economy and job creation, sort of the more economic aspect of it. And what we've seen is that as the pandemic has sort of ebbed and waned, having a plan to recover has moved from either the top spot down to the bottom, back to the top. And then the ability to restore trust has been more connected to some of the protests we saw. It was certainly high during the Black Lives Matter protests in early June. It's been on the rebound, I think, in the last week, I think partially because of the DNC's focus on the topic. But the issue here, or the important thing rather here, is to note that when we ask who's better on each of these, Biden has an advantage on dealing with the coronavirus and on restoring trust. Trump only has an advantage when the focus is on the economy. And that's why I said earlier that it's a real open question of how much focus we're going to have on the coronavirus going forward, because for the president to win, he needs the focus to be not on the pandemic and not on the people dying and not on all the restrictions we're having to deal with to have safe lives, but instead on the economic recovery where he's stronger. And it's going to be hard for him to do that until we actually have a good path forward through the coronavirus. But that's really his mission over the next 2.5 months, is to figure out a way to get America to focus on the economy and not really worry about the coronavirus. They've tried just saying that. It's not really worked yet. So maybe they'll be trying to really push things like vaccines or other sort of preventative measures to come out before the election day. This is a similar map. You should recognize it. This is, rather than though Trump's approval rating, this is what the state level polling shows across the country. And again, we're focusing on that same set of states in the upper Midwest, the Southern Atlantic region, and the Southwest. However, at least at this moment in time, a lot of those states are looking a little bit safer for Biden than competitive. For instance, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania all have a 5 or 6 percentage point or higher advantage for Biden. Nevada has a 6-point advantage for Biden. And then there's some states that have been relatively Republican in the last couple of election cycles that may be a little bit competitive, like Texas, like Georgia, like Ohio. So we're sort of watching to see if the ballot tightens up, if these states end up actually being competitive or not. But I do think we're going to really be looking at a lot of the same states we did in 2016 to understand what's going to happen with the Electoral College. Those states in the upper Midwest that we expect to be a little bit tighter, and then places like North Carolina, Florida, Arizona. If we do Texas or Georgia, that may be fun because we don't really do a lot of state polling in those places, but I do think it's going to be those same 2016 battlegrounds that we're going to be paying a lot of attention to as we move forward, because we do expect the ballot to tighten a little bit. We do expect things to get a little bit closer as Trump has his Republican convention next week, and as there's a concerted amount of campaign advertising designed to bring Biden's negative numbers up and his favorable numbers down, and sort of try to make this a little bit more of a competitive environment, much more like 2016, where people were like, I don't like either of these people, but at least Trump's entertaining. When we look down ballot, we see Democrats have an edge in congressional races and on the Senate. However, one thing that's interesting to note is the generic congressional ballot. The margins only is about the same among registered voters, 45 to 39, as the president, as the margin for the president, the 9 points is about the same as the president. So Democrats aren't really seeing any, or Republicans rather, aren't really seeing any advantage down ballot. We're really seeing an effect up and down the ballot of what's happening right now. So it's not like we're going to see Trump potentially lose the White House, but Republicans make gain down ballot. We're really seeing a lot of symmetry going on throughout. The Senate, rather, that's true. In the House, it's a little bit closer. But again, the 6 points and then 9 points there suggest that maybe the House is not quite as affected, but there is definitely the potential for Democratic gains across the board. And then again, our sort of what we expect to happen down ballot, and this is again, it's unchanged really from last month. We expect Democrats, given their current majority in the House of Representatives, to hold on to that majority. The Senate remains a toss-up. It could go either way. It could even come down to who the vice president ends up being. So Pence or Harris may end up being the tiebreaker if the chamber is split 50-50. The last section I want to talk about is a couple of data points we have about election legitimacy. We've seen the president spending a lot of time recently calling into question voting by mail and the legitimacy of the election. He's floated ideas like delaying the election to deal with fraud or to deal with the coronavirus. And then we saw former President Obama last night make a very pointed critique of President Trump and saying that the White House would do anything to stay in power, even tear down democratic norms. And I think that is something to be aware of and be concerned of going forward. For instance, one big change is because of the coronavirus, there is a lot of states who have shifted their voting method and are allowing voting by mail or no excuse absentee voting. And it's going to be an unprecedented level. In 2016, we saw 45% of all votes were cast early. We expect that to be substantially higher this go around. Maybe 60% of all votes may be cast before Election Day. And the election actually kind of starts on September 4th. North Carolina mails out their ballots on the 4th. So theoretically, people can be voting on September 5th, less than a month away. But as we sort of see people voting with these new methods, as we see states trying to struggle with how they actually run these elections during COVID with all of these new vote by mail, things like that, there's a lot of potential for uncertainty. There's a lot of potential for people just to make honest mistakes, but there's also a lot of potential for people to call into question the legitimacy of the thing. And we see right now that Americans are concerned about the legitimacy of the election. 68% say that they're concerned about voter suppression. 69% are worried about voter fraud, organized voter fraud. And you can see it's a majority of everyone that are concerned about these things, though suppression is a little bit more of a concern for Democrats, fraud's a little bit more concern to Republicans. But there are these high rates out there of people concerned about the election, concerned about that this is not necessarily going to be a fair or legitimate election. And I think that as we move forward and as we see this sort of continued sort of rumination from the president about what's fair or what's not fair and trying to call into question anything other than him winning. And then on the Democrats, the very pointed critiques like we saw from Obama last night, I think this is just going to get a little bit worse as we move forward. But yet we do see Americans continuing to be pretty solidly behind the idea of having the election as scheduled. When we asked if the United States should postpone the election to prevent voter fraud or coronavirus pandemic, we found 3 out of 4 Americans said no. Only 1 in 4 said that they would support that idea. And then when we asked more specifically why people thought Trump was trying to postpone the election, we saw a little bit of why is because a lot of people understand that, or believe that rather, that Trump is doing so for his own political gains and is not trying to sort of serve the legitimate purposes he says he's trying to serve, which I think, again, just feeds into that sort of whole legitimacy question. And if with all these mail-in ballots and all of these other things, if we don't know who the winner is on election night, if it takes longer for all of these jurisdictions to count up the ballots, that is going to be the big open question is, is the country strong enough? Do we have enough faith in our institutions? Is the media responsible enough to get us through a period of uncertainty about what happens after the election and actually come out the other side with some confidence and some certainty about the future of the country? So that is it. All of our public opinion research is available on our website. We are still doing a ton of it. We're particularly moving into election season, election mode. We'll start our own state polling after Labor Day that you'll be able to find, of course, on our website. And then with that, I would be happy to answer any questions. Please use that Q&A box with the application to submit any ideas you have or anything you'd like to talk about at more length. All right. First question, any data on Kanye West? Yeah, so actually I had started putting a slide together on that and didn't have time to, sorry. So Kanye West is trying to get on the ballot for president across the country. He's not going to be able to get on the ballot in enough states to actually win outright. He's missed the deadline in too many places to get 270 electoral college votes, but he can get on the ballot in a lot of states. And I think it's an open question of what his impact is. We did a poll with Reuters 2 weeks ago where we asked essentially the full ballot of Trump, Biden, West, the Libertarian candidates, and the other third-party candidates, and then we also asked just the 2-person ballot, just Trump and Biden. And when we did that, we saw one that West didn't get a lot of votes. He got 3%, I think, of the vote among registered voters in our poll. So not a lot. And honestly, that's probably would be more than he'd actually get, again, because he's not going to be on the ballot everywhere. But those votes did come almost entirely from Joe Biden. They were people who, in the 2-way ballot, said that they would vote for Biden. In the full ballot went for West. So the idea that Kanye West may act as a spoiler, that he may siphon votes for Biden and therefore give Trump a little bit of an advantage, has a little bit of merit. Like there is some truth to that could happen. For it to happen, though, the election is going to have to be pretty close. Essentially, Biden's going to have a 1 or 2 percentage point lead over Trump for West being on the ballot to make enough of a difference. And West particularly pulls from younger men, particularly younger Black men. I think the other thing is Biden has been trying to appeal to younger voters, particularly younger voters of color. And if they're able to make any more inroads, we might see that effect diminish a little bit. But yes, I think at least at the moment, if Kanye West is able to get on the ballot, he can have an impact in really close races. If Biden's winning by 3, 4, 5 points, probably won't make a difference. But if it's a 1 percentage point election, like it was in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin in 2016, it might be enough to make a difference. Let's see. Question, how can I get the presentation? We will be emailing it out to you tomorrow-ish, probably, maybe Monday. It'll also be available on our website tomorrow. You'll be able to, you can wait for it, we'll send it to you, or you can go and download it, but either way, you'll be able to get access to it. Ipsos looked at the president's approval ratings across different states, especially swing states. Are you guys looking at Biden's favorability ratings in those same swing states? Yes, we are. And Biden's favorability ratings are what we would refer to as barely above water. That is, he has slightly more people who are favorable of him than unfavorable, which isn't a great place to be, but is in fact a lot better than Trump is, whose favorability ratings are underwater. He has significantly more people who are unfavorable of him than favorable, and is a better place than Hillary Clinton was in 2016, who also had underwater favorability ratings with, something between 55 and 60% of people unfavorable towards her for 40% who are favorable. That maps roughly to the inverse of what Trump's approval rating is. So the places where Trump is popular, Biden is not popular, and the places where Trump is unpopular, Biden is more popular. We do, though, see that Biden's favorability in those upper Midwestern states is also a little bit stronger than it would be just sort of based on sort of averages, which I think reflects sort of his appeal as sort of a white male, sort of somebody who identifies as sort of a blue collar, sort of that background. It helps him with the constituencies in the upper Midwest who sort of find that more appealing. So he's a little bit stronger in those states. And again, that's why we think those are going to be one of the battlegrounds for the country. Is the president's popularity remains a little bit higher there. His approval is more like 44 or 45% in those states, but Joe Biden is also a little bit more favored. His favorability rating is a little bit like 55% rather than 50 there. So it really is going to come down to sort of which one makes the case. And again, also how much the coronavirus pandemic sort of dominates how people are viewing the election. Other questions? Will Harris's pick actually help Biden on the ballot? So we don't know yet if the Harris nomination is going to help Biden's vote share. Traditionally, vice presidential picks don't have a huge impact at the national level on the election. I think Harris was a good pick in that she's interesting and historic, but she's also kind of safe and is the pick everybody kind of expected her to make. Expected Biden to make. She's been vetted, so presumably she won't have any major scandals that could come out that could potentially damage the Biden candidacy. But people really have mostly made up their mind on Biden. And again, I think the bigger question, of course, is Donald Trump. The election is, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, a referendum on Trump. So it's really going to be about views of the president first and foremost. And Harris's presence on the ticket may help on the margins, but I don't think it's going to have any major impact. Though again, much like the Kanye West question a few minutes ago, maybe the margins matter. 2016 was one of those elections where a dozen things broke Donald Trump's way for him to win. It might be the case again this year. How likely is it that Texas will go blue this year? I know the data is floated around and hyped in 2016. It didn't pan out. If I had to bet money on Texas going blue, I'd probably say no. I think it's getting closer. I think it is getting more competitive. I think the suburbs of Dallas and Houston are getting to be more competitive, and Austin are definitely getting more competitive. You have the border counties of Texas that are actually pretty Democratic areas, highly Hispanic population. But I don't think Texas is quite there yet. That being said, Biden is making inroads with older white voters and with suburban white voters. And if he's able to continue making those inroads, he can have some success. Because I think the thing to remember about Texas is it has sort of the romantic idea of, cowboys and oil men and sort of that thing. But the reality of Texas is Dallas, Houston, Austin, they're cities and suburbs. They're southern cities and suburbs, right? So, big cars and steaks and all that, but they're cities and suburbs, and they have that same sort of urban, suburban, rural dynamic that the rest of the country does. And if Biden can continue making inroads with those suburban voters, he can potentially pull Texas into play, but I don't know if I would necessarily count on it. I think the other thing to think about with Texas is that Trump has been losing ground with college-educated whites. Texas actually has a highly educated population on the whole, so he's been losing ground with a lot of those voters, and that's, I think, the other thing to keep in mind is does sort of Texas's sort of cultural conservatism sort of override some of the sort of the highly educated white populations in Dallas and Austin, sort of idea that maybe the country could be run a little bit better and a little bit more calmly by a Democrat. We'll see how it happens, but that either way, I think Texas will be competitive someday. I just don't know if it's today. Any historical data or predictions about the impact debates will have on candidates' preference or favorability? So debates have had a big impact in the past when the candidates aren't very well known, because they're an opportunity for the candidates to introduce themselves to the public. That's not really the case this year. Everyone knows who Donald Trump is. Almost everyone knows who Joe Biden is. So I don't think that the debates have a huge potential to have a positive impact. Now debates can have a negative impact. That is, if you do a particularly bad job, it can have a negative drag on your approval ratings or favorability ratings or even your vote share. And I think that's sort of one of the big question marks is Joe Biden is sort of well known for not being the most able to get his words out smoothly. And will the debates highlight that or not, I think is an open question. It's certainly one that the Trump camp has been trying to float around, is the idea that Biden is maybe not cognitively all there. Incidentally, we have data on that where more Americans think Biden has the cognitive wherewithal to be president than Trump. So take that for what it is. But, I think the debates are the kind of situation where something can go bad and change things, but no one's going to win the debate. Someone could just lose it, perhaps. Debates also don't typically have a long life of effect. They typically will last a couple of days, a week maybe tops, before the effect goes away. I think you'd have to see a real major catastrophe, a real meltdown for it to have something that actually changes the trajectory of the election. But again, we have two 70-something-year-old candidates, and who knows what could happen. In terms of demographics, profession, age, gender, what is the dominant sector of Republican voters that Trump is losing in that 8%? Trump is losing Republicans who are highly educated, so people who have, post-college degrees, and Republicans who live in more urban or suburban areas. Those are the ones who are sort of the piece of the Republican base that they're losing. And of course, Republicanism sort of sees itself as, more suburban and rural, but the truth is that they still have a substantial number of people who live in places like New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles, and that's sort of where he's been losing ground the most notably, but he has lost a little bit of ground sort of across the board, again, principally with that college educated cohort, but even with non-college educated whites as well. So I think that's sort of the challenge that they're facing, is that they don't really have one place. The Trump campaign doesn't really have one place they have to focus to shore that support up. It sort of has to be shored up all across the board. What are the changes needed for Florida to go blue? So Florida is the perennial bellwether state, the perennial toss-up battleground. It's actually been trending red recently. We saw in 2016 it went red. In 2018, it went red for the gubernatorial and Senate race there. However, if you look at the demographics of Florida, there's really three parts of the state. There's North and West Florida, including the Panhandle, that's very conservative, very Republican, and it's essentially an extension of the Deep South. There's Central Florida, which is sort of similar in character to the Middle Atlantic states, so like North Carolina or Virginia, and then there's South Florida, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, that area, which is a little bit closer in character to sort of the Northeast, so New York, New Jersey. And those areas are essentially roughly the same size population-wise. So, Republicans get most of the votes in the North and the West. Democrats get most of the votes in the South and the southern part of the state. And then that middle part, that's Orlando and Tampa, is that battleground area. And that's where Republicans have had some success lately winning in those areas. So Democrats are going to need to figure out a way to crack those areas to be able to win the state. It's certainly on the table. It's certainly palatable that they could do so, but it has been a challenge for Republicans running statewide for the past couple of election cycles. At the moment, there's only one Democrat in Florida who is elected to statewide office, the agriculture commissioner, I think. So it's been a tough state for them, but again, if Biden holds on to an 8-point advantage nationwide, that probably parlays into having enough votes in Florida to win. All right, that is the last question I see on here. So thank you for joining today. If you do have any other questions, please don't hesitate to shoot us a note. We're always happy to talk. Otherwise, we will be posting this on our website, ipsos.com. We'll be sending it out to you over the next couple of days as well, and an email follow-up. And be well. Good luck. Talk to everyone again in a month.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Chris did get through everyone's questions, and we will, as he said, emailing a direct link to today's recorded presentation. But in the meantime, please do reach out to us. We would love to speak to you. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.